The human was still breathing. Physician Secundus Veltara checked the readings a third time, then set the scanner down on the tray beside him and simply stared. The numbers had not changed. They would not change. They were, as far as he could determine, accurate. 3 of his own kind would have died from the first wound alone. The projectile, a crude thing, metal and powder, the kind of weapon his people had stopped using 4 centuries ago, had passed clean through the soldier's left side, destroying a section of tissue that in any species Veltara had ever treated was simply not negotiable. You needed it. It kept you alive. That was the arrangement the universe had made with living things, and in his 30 years of medicine he had never seen anything break it. The human, apparently, had not been informed of this arrangement. Or perhaps she had been informed and simply disagreed. She had been pulled from the battlefield 6 hours ago, unconscious, bleeding steadily from 3 separate wounds, her armor cracked across the chest from what appeared to be a secondary impact, a fall or perhaps a blast. The field team had brought her in more out of respect than hope. Humans were allies now, strange, loud, exhausting allies, who laughed too often and asked too many questions, and had somehow talked their way into a war that was not originally theirs to fight. It had seemed wrong to leave one of them dying face down in the gray mud of Sector 12. No one had expected her to survive the transport. No one had expected her to still be breathing by the time Veltara began his assessment. And yet, he pulled a stool to the side of the bed and sat down. Around him the medical bay hummed quietly. Other patients, other monitors, the low, careful movements of his staff. None of them looked at the human. They had learned in the weeks since this unlikely alliance had formed that looking too long at humans tended to raise uncomfortable questions about what the universe considered possible. Veltara looked anyway. She was not large by human standards. Medium height, medium build, the kind of person you would not notice in a crowd. Her hair was dark and cut short in the practical style most human soldiers preferred. There was a scar along her jaw that predated this battle by years, old and clean, the kind that came from surviving something that should not have been survived. He was beginning to think that might be a pattern. Her name, according to the identification pulled from her suit, was Sergeant Yara Osei, age 29, 8 years of service, deployed to 3 prior conflicts, all of which she had walked away from. Veltara read the service record twice. Then he went back to watching her breathe. She opened her eyes at the 3rd hour. Veltara had not left. He told himself it was professional diligence. A patient in her condition required monitoring. That was true. It was also true that he had not been able to make himself walk away. Her eyes were dark brown, and when they opened, immediately and completely focused. There was no confusion, no slow dragging back to consciousness. She looked at the ceiling, then at the room, then at him, and the entire process took perhaps 2 seconds. "Hey," she said. Her voice came out rough and low, scraped clean by pain, but steady. Veltara had heard the voices of people waking from serious trauma. They were never steady. "You are awake," he said. It was not his most useful observation. "Yeah." She took a slow breath. Her eyes dropped to her own body, taking in the bandaging, the monitoring leads, the IV line running into her left arm. Her expression was calm, curious even, the way one might look at an unexpected bill, mildly inconvenient, nothing more. "How bad?" "Very bad," Veltara said. He saw no reason to soften it. "By any standard I am trained in, you should not be conscious. You should not in fact be alive." Something moved in her expression. Not quite a smile, but close to it. "But I am," she said. "Yes, good." She let her head fall back against the pillow. "Did we win? Sector 12. Did we hold it?" Veltara paused. "Yes." The line held. She closed her eyes again. He watched her breathe for a moment, certain she had slipped back into unconsciousness. But then, quietly, she said, "Good. That's good." And something in her voice, the relief in it, the weight of it, The way it sounded less like a soldier receiving a report, and more like a person setting down something very heavy, made Velthara sit very still. He had treated hundreds of soldiers in his career. He knew what relief sounded like when the body was safe, when the personal danger had passed. This was not that. She was not relieved because she had survived. She was relieved because the line had held. He sat with that for a long time after she fell back to sleep. Velthara had studied humans for 2 years before the war began. This was longer than most. The alliance had formed quickly, as alliances born from mutual desperation tend to do, and there had been little time for the careful cultural exchange that diplomats preferred. Most of his colleagues knew human biology only in the broad strokes: bipedal, oxygen-breathing, remarkably fragile, surprisingly aggressive, prone to what their own literature described as heroics, and what Velthara's people would have called catastrophically poor risk assessment. He had gone further. He had read their history, their wars, their medical texts, their survival accounts, their myths and their news archives. He had watched hours of their recorded conflicts, not for strategy, but for understanding. He had believed going in that he understood them well enough. He had been wrong. The error was not in the facts. The facts were accurate. Humans were, in almost every measurable way, unremarkable as a species. Their bones were fragile compared to a dozen others. Their healing was slow. Their lives were short. They had no natural armor, no venom, no enhanced sensory apparatus. They could not survive extremes of temperature or pressure that other species handled routinely. They needed constant food and water and sleep. They were, on paper, extraordinarily high-maintenance organisms, with a frustrating tendency to break down. What no textbook had captured, what he suspected no textbook could capture, because it was not the kind of thing that fit neatly into data, was the refusal. They refused. That was the only word for it. When the body failed, when the situation was hopeless, when every law of biology and probability said stop, the human did not stop. The human looked at all of that information, processed it, and then continued anyway. Not from ignorance, not because they hadn't understood, because understanding had never, for humans, been sufficient reason to quit. He had read accounts of humans surviving blood loss that should have caused cardiac failure, surviving injuries that should have caused immediate unconsciousness, surviving environments that should have caused death within minutes. In every case, the explanation given was the same. They didn't stop moving. They kept going. They refused to acknowledge the body's requests for surrender. He had read those accounts and thought, exaggeration, cultural mythology, the kind of stories species told about themselves to feel brave. He was no longer sure of that. He looked at Sergeant Yara Osei, sleeping in a hospital bed with a hole in her that should have killed her, and he thought about what it must feel like from the inside, to be a species that had not been given the gifts of strength or speed or resilience, to have survived anyway, to have looked at an indifferent universe that offered nothing but difficulty, and decided, collectively, across thousands of years and millions of individuals, that this was fine, that they would figure it out. To have meant it. On the 4th day, she sat up on her own. Velthara arrived for his morning assessment to find her already upright, examining the bandaging on her side with the focused attention of someone conducting a professional review. "You should not be sitting," he said. "Probably not," she agreed, without sitting down. He sighed and came to check her readings. They were, again, better than they had any right to be. Her tissue was knitting. Not quickly, not miraculously, but steadily, and with a kind of grim determination that he was starting to recognize as characteristic. "How is the pain?" he asked. "Manageable," she said. "On a scale?" "Manageable," she said again, and looked at him with a calm that closed the topic. On the 5th day, she asked for food. Real food, she specified, solid, with flavor, not the nutritional paste the medbay provided. He authorized a food request through the human liaison on base. and was slightly alarmed by how quickly she ate when it arrived. "You were hungry," he observed. "Always," she said, and smiled at him for the first time. It was a wide, sudden thing, like most things about her, too large, too bright, and completely certain of itself. On the 6th day, she asked to go back. "Back," he repeated. "To the front." Her voice was perfectly level. "Sector 12, or wherever they've moved to. I need to know my unit's status, and I need to get back to them." "You have wounds that are still closing." "You lost significant blood volume less than a week ago." "I know." "The trauma to your Velthara." She said his name carefully. I know all of it. I'm still asking." He looked back at her for a long moment. "2 more days," he said. That smile again, wide and bright and slightly unnerving. "Deal." She left on the 8th day, earlier than agreed, because a transport was available, and she had never intended to wait for the 9th. He had known she would do this. He walked to the bay doors and watched her go. She moved carefully, not slowly, but with the deliberate economy of someone managing pain without advertising it. Her gear bag over one shoulder, her repaired armor over the other. At the door she stopped and turned. "Thank you," she said, genuinely. "Try not to return," he said. She grinned, walked out. The doors closed behind her. He heard about Sector 9 11 days later. In fragments, in corridors, the Cathari had pushed hard on the northern flank. A new formation, something that had broken 3 defensive lines before it was stopped. It had been stopped. He heard the name mentioned once in passing, by a logistics officer who didn't know he was listening. Osei's squad held the breach for 4 hours until reinforcements arrived. 4 hours, with 6 people. He stopped walking. He thought about her. About the wound still knitting when she left. About the calm in her eyes. About what it must look like from the other side of that battlefield. To bring force that had broken everything before it, and find 6 people who simply would not move. Not because they couldn't be hurt, but because they had decided not to. Because something in them, some deep and unreasonable fire, had looked at everything coming and said, "Not today. Not this line. Not while we're still standing." He wondered if the Cathari were beginning to understand what they were actually fighting. It wasn't a military. It wasn't numbers or technology. It was a species that had been told by everything, by biology, by probability, by the cold arithmetic of the universe, that it should not exist, and had refused to accept that. 30,000 years of refusing, and they were still here. That night, Velthara opened his medical log for the first time in weeks. He did not write about the wound. He did not write about recovery data or cellular regeneration rates. He did not write in the careful clinical language he used for everything else. He wrote about the moment she asked if they won, about the relief in her voice when the answer was yes, about how it had nothing to do with herself. He wrote about the smile, the one that was too wide and too bright, and completely, utterly undefeated. He wrote about a species that had looked at a universe vast and cold and indifferent, offering nothing freely and taking everything eventually, and decided to stay, not because it was easy, not because they had been given the tools for it, but because somewhere in the long chain of their becoming they had made a choice, deep and collective and unspoken, to be the kind of thing that stayed, that held the line, that came back. He sat back, read what he had written, and added one final line at the bottom. He kept it simple, because the truth he had found usually was, "I finally understand why they are still here, and I understand now why the enemy is afraid."